Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth webinar of AI Connect 2 on AI explainability, accountability, and trust. Now, what do these three words mean? Explainability allows us to understand how AI systems make decisions. Accountability ensures that there are clear responsibilities and technical measures in place to ensure that these systems are open to inquiry. And then trust is a product of these and the other principles that we've discussed, all working in tandem. Today's panel will address these themes in the context of content, authentication, and provenance, essentially the origin and authenticity of a piece of content that we see online. Now, it's not often that I can say the phrase stellar lineup of speakers and have that be an understatement. So we have a stellar lineup of speakers for you today. But without further ado, I'll introduce our keynote speaker to kick us off. We have with us Dr. Ruman Chaudhary. Dr. Chaudhary is the CEO of the tech nonprofit Humane Intelligence, as well as the US Science Envoy for Artificial Intelligence. She's also a responsible AI fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center. And previously, Dr. Chaudhary was the director of ML ethics, transparency, and accountability at Twitter, as well as the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture. She's been named Time's 100 most influential people in AI, BBC's 100 women, and Forbes's one of 5 who are shaping AI, among many other accolades. With that, Dr. Chaudhary, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. And I have a short 10 minutes, and I wanted to start off with a framing of the conversation in my keynote and how I hope it informs the conversation about content authenticity provenance as it relates to trust. So what I work on broadly, as Trisha's mentioned, is responsible use of AI, and I have been for some years. Now, traditionally, my experience has been more in the industry sector. I also had a startup in between, Accenture and Twitter. But today I actually sit as somebody who runs a nonprofit. I'm also the United States Science Envoy for Artificial Intelligence. So, and especially in this year of elections, it is really critical to think through how to build these technologies such that there's trust with the end user. So the conversation or the keynote that I'll kick off today that hopefully will guide some of the conversation is actually more about what's happening in the global arena. So let me just share my screen quickly. And then, perfect. I will minimize this. Okay, great. There you go. So I want to start off by level setting about what generative AI has brought to us. So generative AI has revolutionized the accessibility of AI systems. And what that means is that it's not just that this is a sort of a fancy new technology, et cetera, but it's that it is in everybody's hands. And in fact, the technology can often be quite crude and not capable. And in some ways that makes things worse. And this has been building on an increasing no code revolution, right? If we think about, the latest unicorns in tech, a lot of them have been built on making AI accessible to all kinds of people who will use it integrated into what they're doing. But with that actually comes some of the issues that actually have been plaguing AI for years. So the conversation that may be new to people who are just entering the field of AI because of the accessibility of generative AI, let me tell you, these are not new problems. They're pretty old. And actually, even some of the new problems that are cropping up are old problems that we had thought we had solved. So this is introducing gender bias, race-based bias, but also another end, supercharging malicious actors who'll be able to then increasingly scale mis and disinformation campaigns. Last November, I had a paper that I wrote for UNESCO on technology facilitated gender-based violence, which is a bit of a mouthful. TFGBV is even possibly more of a mouthful, but it is about how online harassment, the chronic harassment of women in particular, but also I'll expand that to say women and all minorities, has will be supercharged using Gen AI. TFGBV, UNESCO had previously written a series of papers on something called the chilling, which was about the chilling effect on women in particular in prominent positions such as journalism, politics, ones in which you can't just remove yourself from the digital sphere. So Gen AI is not just introducing this new and interesting technology to a lot of people, it is also supercharging the harms that we have seen for a while. And again, to kick off, I wanted to sort of talk through what's happening in this ecosystem of engagement. I'll pause for a minute to say we spend a lot of time talking about what industry is building, and overwhelmingly, the space of responsible AI has been dominated by industry and civil society kind of engaged in this pushing back and forth. And now, in the last year, basically, I'll say we've seen an explosion of government engagement, which has introduced a new paradigm to the conversation. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to engage the public meaningfully, because that's a phrase we all use. So, what does that mean? So, global policy, this time, or, well, April of last year, I wrote an article for Wired on how AI desperately needs global oversight. At that time, none of the organizations that I think everybody on this panel and here today were part of existed, which is actually pretty amazing. These institutions are not perfect. These groups are not perfect. There's a lot of issues and things that can be fixed and resolved. However, I will say it is an impressive feat for global organizations to be mobilizing as quickly as they are. And as you can probably tell by my background, I am currently sitting in a hotel room in Zurich, Switzerland, and I have been on the road since May 23rd. And that's right, not June, May 23rd. And that is the state of sort of global governance. It can be a little bit disparate at the moment, but there is a lot of work that's happening. So last year, after my article, I actually testified to Congress. And again, this was in June. At that time, if you look at some of the comments I'm making here, I'll point to the fact that at that time, we did not have a safety institute in the US. We did not actually have any sort of global AI governance. So my third and fourth point were things that did not exist in June of last year that exist today. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the first two, right? Access for independent research and audit, and then also investment and legal protections for independent red teaming and ethical hacking. Because as we think about things like provenance, as we think about things especially like mis and disinformation and provenance of media, deepfakes, as it relates to sensitive issues like the elections, I will tell you from my time at Twitter, this is going to be a highly, highly contentious space. So I know there's a lot of effort being put into creating watermarking and provenance identification, and a lot of that work is amazing. However, I will say that is only going to solve a small part of the problem. I'll talk about that in a minute. So, in the US and UK really kicked off the global conversation. Globally, now we've seen the first global agreement on the ethics of AI being adopted and advisory bodies being set up all over the world. One thing that is missing from this conversation is meaningful engagement with global South nations, in particular ones that are not major players. So, for example, we see a few nations that are not Western in a lot of these rooms and narratives, Singapore being a major player, which is wonderful, and in some cases, India. However, I will say, there is still a pretty minimal, quote, global conversation happening that includes engagement from global majority countries. Although, as I mentioned, these processes are imperfect. It is interesting to see that for the France Safety Summit, which is taking place next February, they have appointed somebody to actually specifically be engaged in diversifying and having a global conversation in that room. So I'm talk a little bit about what industry has been building. My career in responsible AI started at Accenture, where I built a global responsible AI practice. And in doing that, a few of us, and you may actually recognize some of the names on here, wrote a paper on how to put responsible AI into practice. This had, 5 things that, we consider to be critically important. And even though we wrote the paper in 2020 and it was based on work we were doing prior to then, some of these things are still things that we need to discuss and develop further. Specifically, number 2, how we measure success. 3, safe channels to resolve tensions, and 4, the value of the ecosystem. So measuring success is more than just measuring the performance of a person. There are ways we can and should examine the performance of models. And again, especially as it relates to people's the trustworthiness of these institutions as they build AI systems that they say will increasingly impact our lives. Why would we engage with it if the measurement of performance for these models in particular are not based on things like generalizability, robustness, validity in a wide range of settings, right? So if we purely base it on very traditional metrics of performance, we're not embracing the socio-technical nature of how these models should be evaluated. The second is safe channels to resolve tensions. Overwhelmingly, when there have been whistleblower moments in organizations, it is somebody who has been actually very dedicated to the company and dedicated to the cause and the vision of the company, who felt like their very grounded and real ethical questions were not being resolved and instead were being handled poorly. Now, if we don't actually have safe channels to resolve tensions to protect people and also protect people if they do enter whistleblower status, this will actually be an impediment to responsible and irresponsible use. I also get a lot of questions about AI and the future of work. This is actually an older paper published by OpenAI and economists. Since then, there's been actually a very interesting paper by Professor Daron Acemoglu. You may know his name if you're an economist. He's a very well-respected economist on the macroeconomic impact of AI systems on the global workforce. It may actually be quite minimal. And yesterday there was a very interesting paper coming out of Goldman Sachs that was questioning the level of investment being put into these systems and whether or not we're actually going to see the returns that claims are being made that we will have. So interesting note as we move to thinking about public feedback. So as I mentioned earlier, provenance, and understanding watermarking, etc., is but one part of the conversation. At Twitter and in any social media company, we actually start years in advance of an election thinking through mis and disinformation campaigns, and a lot of it, most of it, is actually about understanding human behavior as they interact with these systems, and generative AI is no different. So again, while it is important that we look at very clear deepfaked images, a lot of these are actually policy decisions being put into an algorithm. So what do I mean by that? I wrote an article earlier this year for Nature, which was an early observation of what we have seen in this year of elections. So I think it's something like, you know, most countries in the world are having a significant election this year. The earliest elections have actually been in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And what I did was take some learnings from there and how we have seen deepfakes manifesting and what we need to learn as we pursue election integrity in the United States. And the most interesting takeaway has been that we tend to frame deepfakes as a malicious, as a generation of a malicious image that's intended to make somebody look bad. So this could be, a picture of the current president doing something they shouldn't be doing, etc. So maliciously used. What I actually found, and where I think there's going to be a lot of questions to be answered, is that candidates are using deepfake technologies as a way of softening their public image. And I coined the term soft fakes, right? So in Indonesia, their election was won by somebody who used to be known as quite literally like somebody who was genocidal. And I think the BBC had once had a pretty targeted article about him where they called him blood soaked, like his blood soaked historical past. But he underwent, as the kids would say, a social media glow up. And there was a lot of generative AI being used to soften his image. How? So some of it actually is very obviously deepfaked. So using the Pixar imagery to make somebody look softer and cuter and more approachable, creating deepfakes of them singing nostalgic songs. His party also made a deepfake video of Suharto, who every Indonesian knows has passed away, advocating for their party to be elected into power. So what do we do about soft fakes? And it also blurs a line. And it's not just, this is not the first election. We're seeing it in the New York City mayoral election. Eric Adams used deepfake technology to do robocalls in Mandarin and Yiddish. And he has then since joked that people will come up to him asking if he knows their language. Now, that is in an interesting gray area of whether or not it is harmful to do that. Is it misleading to a member of the public? If you hear a robocall by the mayor speaking your language, does that make you think that this person actually cares about you or knows about you? So these are so moving beyond provenance, watermarking, there's a significant amount of gray area that we need to think about when we talk about trustworthiness, information integrity. So one approach that we're taking, and I'll wrap up very quickly, is this concept of structured public feedback. So my team at Twitter launched the first algorithmic bias bounty. In 2022, I started Humane Intelligence, where we were the first nonprofit dedicated to doing these programs. We hosted the largest ever generative AI red teaming challenge last year. And the goal of all of this is to bring in the public in a meaningful way, not as sort of a mass, send me your opinion. So what we'll find is, and there is value to this, but increasingly it's becoming an onerous task where public organizations will put out a request for comment. They will receive literally thousands of pieces of individual feedback from organizations, people, etc. And it is very difficult to take that and translate that into something actionable. So the purpose of structured public feedback is a method of assurance, of figuring out whether or not the model is performing as expected, and inviting members of the public or people who are not engaged in developing the model, even at the organization itself, in giving you feedback. So it is an external public perspective. So as I mentioned last year, we did the largest ever generative AI red teaming challenge, 2,200 people. Our evaluations were really interesting. We learned about how people interact with models, and especially again, as we think through information integrity, as a lot of these companies are pushing us to move away from traditional search engines and move towards using language models for search, we find that large language models will often reflect the biases. So if you build or work with language models, something called the 3 H's. The 3 H's, one of them is for the model to be helpful. So when a model is helpful, we have found in multiple red teaming exercises that the model will pick up, whether explicitly or implicitly, what the individual is actually asking for and feed them a response that would be helpful to them as in reinforcing their worldview. So how can we think of information integrity as a byproduct of how LLMs should be built, given that companies are pushing LLMs to be the primary source of our interaction with the world, and again, Google and other companies have made a move to try to replace search engines. But, given the poor performance of language models, have rolled that back. We've also found that LLMs tend to be a mirror versus a radicalized. So that's actually an interesting departure from traditional social media algorithms. Social media algorithms can radicalize. They feed you an increasing amount of content that is more not only reinforcing, but driving you towards a perspective. Language models tend to reflect, basically give you your energy back. And in a few cases, we actually saw the model de-escalate, which was very fascinating. So the community of practice that Humane Intelligence is building is to help train individuals on how to do evaluations of AI models. So we are embarking on a series of bias bounty challenges from beginner to advanced. Each has $10,000 in prizes. Our first one actually is about ultimately creating a probability estimation model that determines whether or not a prompt will lead to a malicious outcome. And in this case, malicious outcome can also mean things like misdirection, which information integrity would fall under. So again, our goal and what we're trying to build is a community of practice so that everybody is engaged in evaluating these models. As I mentioned, a lot of what we talk about when we talk about information integrity actually are policy decisions put into code. Now, who is in that room when policy is being created? Who is in that room when it's being decided what is allowed to be said publicly or not said publicly, or how something should be framed? I'll also be so bold to say, as what I have learned from social media that I've carried over into generative AI, is literally every question actually is a question of content moderation. It's who gets to see what, when, and how, and who gets to decide who gets to see what, when, and how. And no matter what problem you raise in the world of generative AI, I promise you it will boil down to those series of questions. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. A lot to absorb through your presentation here, including the term that you coined, soft fakes. We saw some of those in the Indian election as well, with the Prime Minister doing funny popular dances. But yes, thank you. Thank you again for all those insights, which I'm sure the participants have found as useful framing also for the panel discussion going ahead. Right. So with that, we'll be jumping straight into the panel discussion portion of the session today. We're joined by our three expert speakers. Firstly, we have Merve Hickok. Merve is the President and Senior Research Director at the Center for AI and Digital Policy and founder of the AI Ethicist. Her work intersects both AI ethics and policy and governance. She holds several positions, including as a data ethics lecturer at the University of Michigan School of Information. And she's also a member of the IEEE work groups on AI standard setting and open community for ethics in autonomous and intelligent systems. She's been recognized as one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics in 2021. We're also joined by Claire Leibowitz. Claire is the head of AI and media of the AI and Media Integrity Program at the Partnership on AI. She has worked in AI and society for almost a decade and has advised companies, governments, and nonprofit organizations on AI governance, digital media, and information. And finally, we're joined by Maggie Mintz. Maggie is the Director of Public Affairs and Impact at Truepic, which is a company dedicated to pioneering content transparency in AI. And it's also a founding member of the C2PA standard for content authentication and provenance. At Truepic, Maggie leads policy, strategy, and partnerships to advance transparency and authenticity in digital content. So I'll go in quickly to the questions. Merv, I know that you have to leave in roughly 40 minutes. So we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. And also, if the participants have any questions as the discussion is proceeding, please feel free to drop them in the chat. That my first question to all of you as we frame this discussion is, how should organizations, and we can talk about both companies and government agencies, given the context of the Biden executive order on AI, how should they clearly define and assign responsibility for the outcomes and outputs produced by their AI systems? We can start with Merv.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and nice to be back with the AI Connect program. I think my recommendation is not to treat AI as especially generative AI, as a brand new magical thing. It's not different from the technology that we have been dealing for almost a decade now, and we already have good examples of well, product safety, but also AI safety, security, and trustworthiness frameworks across different domains. As a developer of a product, you have responsibility for providing clear information to your consumers and other stakeholders across different industries. For example, FDA, if you're developing a medical AI system, if you're in banking or finance. We had SR 11 model governance guidance since 2011. So we're not really talking about new issues and new problems or new governance and responsibility allocations. I would say it is really it's not like how to define and assign responsibility, but the willingness to do so, and how we can ensure that it is done in the most effective way. And I think I can, in terms of some of the additional frameworks to those I mentioned already, NIST AI risk framework is a great example and is a great resource on how to look at this holistically as socio-technical systems, how to define and assign responsibilities, how to assess these systems, and what to do with your assessment. OECD has a great framework, great references for this, and at the very high level, at the board level, World Economic Forum also had provided years and years ago, governance frameworks. So my focus is really on the motivations, the incentives, and keeping organizations, public and private, accountable for what we already established as good practices.
Thank you, Merv. We can go to Maggie next.
Thanks so much, Trisha. And thank you again for having me. It's great to be with you all today. So I would say my answer is really influenced by where I sit in this whole ecosystem. I think especially for organizations that are thinking about producing or distributing media that is in some way synthetic, especially hyper-realistic images, audio, video, et cetera, because those are so hyper realistic and it is very difficult for the human eye to actually distinguish the difference between what was created by light hitting a camera lens or recorded live versus something that was wholly generated, wholly synthetic. I do really think it's important to invest in transparency technologies of some sort. So there are a number of those that we can discuss in greater detail today. My company, TruePic, works on specifically cryptographic provenance, so disclosing the origin, history, and edits of a piece of content upstream in its life cycle online, and then throughout kind of changes it might undergo online. When we think about certain AI technologies, they can also drive really sophisticated editing, removing or adding pixels, et cetera. But editing, media online also isn't a new issue at all. It long predates sort of the last 2 years of the deepfake revolution, whatever you want to call it. So that type of transparency in media has long been important. And I think in the last 2 years, the importance of that has really been accentuated. So I would say investing in those kinds of technologies that do exist. But beyond that, I think we also need to think about kind of upskilling and education around AI investment and AI literacy, especially for employees who are playing catch up. I mean, I think we've all sort of had to become experts in the last 2 years on a lot of these technologies, and that doesn't happen overnight. And they also do continue to evolve. So those are sort of two ideas from my position in this space.
Thank you, Maggie. And on the topic of upskilling and AI literacy, Claire, I know you also did an interview on the entire Kate Middleton saga earlier this year, but the same question to you.
Yeah, and thank you, Trisha. And I have the privilege of going after everyone and Ruman's really wonderful tee up to this conversation, which again, I'll approach it from my aperture, which is from a multi-stakeholder nonprofit that puts out voluntary guidance on myriad topics, from the future of work to AI and media integrity, where I sit, and how we have healthy information and what that even means in the AI age, and thinking about how we can engage newsrooms, media institutions, orgs like Maggie's, academics, and do that, as Ruman said, meaningful stakeholder engagement in order to do two things: put out voluntary guidance, which is not the perfect panacea for safe and responsible AI, but is a way for us to gather a lot of input from the community, and I would call it front run the policy making that's happening now. So I loved Ruman's observation that in the past year and a half, things have really changed in terms of the policy seat at the table for where safe and responsible AI, who should be kind of mandating these rules. And I'd say from our experience, we launched a voluntary framework now a year and a half ago, which is basically a technology policy on this question of responsible synthetic media. And in that, we attend to several things that have been brought up already. This idea that it's not just AI generated content we're worried about, it's also these echoes of other ways of manipulating content we've had for centuries. I think any good policy needs to kind of show how the values may be coherent across different institutions and that pipeline upstream, downstream, but show the different responsibility from, say, a model developer to the distributor of that content, and really weaving that together, which I know everyone on this call thinks at the ecosystem level, which is what's so important. And when you articulate those values, the second thing I'll name is really being explicit about how you do that in technology. So we hear these words of socio-technical or red teaming, but these can go from high-level ideas to what does it mean for an engineer at OpenAI or a decision maker at the BBC to choose to use deepfake technology to decide if they put a watermark or a sign of cryptographic provenance in a piece of content. Those are very real manifestations of these policies. So at PAI, which maybe we'll be able to talk about, we've put forward case examples for how these different institutions actually enact this policy making that we've done in practice. And to Rumon's point, this also shows these edge cases, which are tricky and may not have perfect solutions, but we can build upon over time.
Thanks, Claire. And with that, we kind of started down the line of how to make these systems intelligible or understandable to users. You mentioned some of the edge use cases, but how do we make sure that AI systems, information about AI systems, is truly accessible to a wide range of stakeholders? So this includes regulators, oversight bodies, impacted individuals, non-experts. We can go back to Claire because you started with that point, and then around the virtual table.
So a few observations on, I guess, transparency, which we all value and has a visceral appeal. And I will say nothing I'm going to say about the complexity of transparency means we should not be transparent. At the same time, we have to remember that these are different people in different contexts coming into contact with content. And what that means is we need better transparency about how platforms and other institutions are studying the impact of these different forms of disclosure, which I'll explain in a second, and more sensitivity to kind of the institutional dynamics that affect people's encounters with AI. So what do I mean by this? And there are both technical, and Maggie can go into this in more detail. There are technical signals, which we've alluded to, like watermarks and cryptographic provenance. And, oftentimes people use the term watermark to refer to all of these different methods, but they're basically technical ways to put signals into or accompanying content to go with it over time, which are imperfect, but they are methods for transparency. And then there's the question of how do you communicate the insight from that technical signal to an end user, which of course seems intuitively appealing. Wouldn't it be great if I can know that Kate Middleton, to use that example, actually edited out her face in that picture and it was fake? And why does that matter? Which is a key question. Wouldn't it be great to know in a political ad that it's actually not Joe Biden, sounding as he did at the debate, or it is in fact him? That seems really important in an era where consumers might not know what they are seeing to be real or true. And real and true are different, which we may get into in a second. But the question of how we explain that to people is still up for debate, and I'd say is the missing piece of this puzzle. So several years ago, we did some user research on Twitter's manipulated media label. This was in 2020. They were deploying this on content that had, to Rumon's point, been misleading to an average user. It didn't have to be AI generated. It just needed to be spliced or edited in a way that might confuse an average user. And we showed this label to folks across the United States and asked them what they thought about it. And people's institutional and partisan bias came through in their attitude towards this label. One man, we asked him what he thought about it, and he thought the label was Twitter trying to tell him that the media was manipulating him, not that the artifact had been manipulated. And it's just a really vivid example of how human beings bring their biases to bear on this content. And in another study, which I'll share in the chat, people's trust in institutions who were doing the labeling was just as important as their actual understanding of the label. So this question of how we better engage civic institutions, libraries, museums, Veterans Affairs committees, trusted intermediaries, and thinking about training and education and this concept of literacy is just as important as actually the language we use accompanying a video or an image. And two final points, just because something is edited does not mean it's true or false. And this is that content moderation question. Kate Middleton probably used AI to edit out her pimples many, many times before that image went viral, but people didn't care because it didn't matter to the truth or falsehood of the image. But when it was a testament to whether or not she was sick or not, that then changed people's understanding of what mattered in terms of the manipulation to make it true or false.
Thanks, Claire. So Maggie, you were mentioned in Claire's remarks in the instance of technical signals in your work. Have you found that those signals are interpretable by an average user? Are there measures that you've been taking?
Thanks, Trisha. So in terms of what's passed through to who in this whole ecosystem, there is a lot of debate there, as Claire acknowledges. I think we're at a moment where that's where the conversation has really moved around some of these technologies, because there are a number of ways to mark a piece of content kind of upstream in its creation process. In terms of the technology that TruePic specifically uses, which is what I can speak to with most expertise. So we're using something called cryptographic provenance. It builds on an open technical standard known as the C2PA. And with that, basically what it does is say how something was created. Was it wholly generated using AI? Was it captured by light hitting a camera lens, which is increasingly becoming very important as we think about sort of securing what's real online and kind of semblance of reality, documenting ground truth, et cetera? Or does it sit somewhere on a spectrum in between those two? And that's where things start to get really interesting really quickly, as Claire alluded to. There are edits that can be made to something that are significant. Pixels could be added or removed. Something could be cropped to actually take somebody out of a photo, et cetera. And then potentially we erase some pimples, we slightly change a filter, et cetera. Does that matter? I'm not necessarily the person to answer that. But what this standard does, because it's based in cryptography, it's able to actually disclose all of those. So it's very information rich in terms of what could be passed through. In terms of what is passed through, the state of things today is really that is ultimately up to these distributing platforms themselves. And with that, we see a variety of things made with AI labels. Sometimes we see something called a content credential, which is the C2PA, as I said, is an open standard. With that, it also has open guidance on user experience that a number of technology companies contribute to say, okay, this is what we found based on our user research internally is significant for people to see and not see. TruePic really specializes in the actual process of affixing that information to a piece of content and also making sure that information is validated, verified, et cetera, before it's actually attached to the content, which is a whole other conversation that we could have. But I think we are seeing sort of a mix of approaches right now. And there's a lot of research that sort of still needs to be done in terms of what is most effective to be passed through. I think some of the basic distinctions in terms of this was wholly created with AI, this was actually created by light hitting a camera lens, and disclosing what system actually made something is really important. We do all rely on digital content every day to make decisions. Ultimately, though, like where should it be required versus where should it be opt-in? Again, I'm not necessarily the person to comment on it, but I think this is where we get into some of the kind of critical debates that are happening right now. And as Dr. Chowdhury said, a lot of these questions do boil down to content moderation at the end of the day. But I think in terms of the way the C2PA is designed, it is designed to give a bit more information, because I think that binary of AI or not is becoming kind of simplistic, realistically, in the world that we live in and the direction these technologies have moved in. A lot of things are composites, and that nuance can be really important for context. If something is or isn't in an image that was or was there before, that's really significant. Especially for what we would maybe call content of consequence. So things that are being used to make really critical decisions. And we could have a whole debate on what that actually entails and includes, et cetera. But I do think if we think about For example, TruePic has done a lot of work with Microsoft documenting the destruction of cultural heritage in Ukraine. We partnered with a USAID implementer there to take authenticated photos that are authenticated using this technology and a number of others to say, hey, this is a real image that was captured at this time in this place on this date. And that is really critical when we think about potentially accountability proceedings, et cetera, and just the record around these events. Additionally, documenting potentially ongoings around a polling place. We're in a major elections year, et cetera. That same technology in partnership with Microsoft is going to be actively used around elections. So I think that's something for us to think about. I don't have necessarily any of the answers, and like Claire referred to, I can kind of speak to some of the technologies, but I do think we're approaching a moment where binary AI or not is really simplistic and doesn't make sense because it's way more nuanced than that. But how much nuance do we pass through? Because every little detail is probably too much information.
Maggie, could I also ask you to just explain what C2PA is for those in the audience who don't know?
Yes, I wish I had done that sooner. It's an acronym I throw around a lot in my day-to-day. So C2PA stands for the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. It's an open technical standard that was founded in 2021 by a number of technologists and civil society partners. So TruePic is a founding member, Microsoft, Adobe, the BBC, Intel Arm, Witness, and others all contribute to this standard. Since 2021, it's grown pretty significantly. We've recently seen Google and OpenAI actually join the standard in the coalition. Because it's an open technical standard, that technically means anybody can implement it. It's really designed to be used by everyone. It's specifically based in cryptography. So some of the features of the standard that I think are important to kind of mention are it's interoperable, it's information rich, and it's tamper evident. Interoperable basically means that content has a very dynamic lifecycle online. We're all very aware of this. The standard is designed such that as content passes between platforms that use this standard, they basically can speak the same language and talk to each other and communicate these critical details. Hey, this system made this thing. It was changed in this way. This is when this happened, et cetera. And then information rich, I kind of went into that earlier, but I think that sort of helps us place content on that spectrum of wholly synthetic to never retouched, nothing, totally raw, light hitting a camera lens, that's it. And then in terms of tamper evidence, that's really based in its cryptographic foundation. So essentially, if content has a C2PA content credential, is what we call it, but then it's changed in some unauthorized way, it'll basically tell you, hey, this has been changed. We don't know how it was changed, but you can almost think of it like a tamper evidence seal on a consumer packaged good of some sort. My background is in consumer protection and product management, and we've all seen it at the grocery store where the seal on something is broken. I'm definitely not going to buy it. You can kind of think of it like that but for digital content. So it's being used in a number of ways, and I can go into that in greater detail, but it's one of these kind of technical approaches that's outlined in NIST guidance. Other approaches would be watermarking and digital fingerprinting, which have their benefits and drawbacks as well. I think we've seen a lot of alignment around C2PA because it is tamper evident, information rich specifically, and also interoperable. And it has a lot of benefits, not just for disclosing AI or not, but again, that sort of spectrum in between.
Great, thank you. My question now to you, Merve. So in 2018, CIDP had put together 12 universal guidelines for AI. One of these guidelines is the identification obligation, which has grown more relevant over time. Could you explain this guideline, and could you explain how you've seen your thinking about the guideline evolve with the advent of these generative AI applications?
Happy to, and thanks also for noting the universal guidelines for AI. I'm going to call it short for UGAI because it is a mouthful instead of repeating it. So to your point, the guideline was developed in 2018, developed and endorsed by more than 300 experts and organizations across 40 countries. And then it was announced at the 2018 International Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners Conference. And if you kind of know the timeline of the principles, the frameworks that came after it, This was right before the OECD AI principles, and it significantly impacted the development and final product OECD AI principles, because we were also working with the working groups there, and then adopted as G20, G20 and G7 principles, etc. So it has been very influential in the wider AI policy and frameworks world. To your point, the guideline has 12 principles towards protection of human rights. And the way that the 12 principles are envisaged as rights for individuals, obligation for organizations, and there are 2 prohibitions, one for secret profiling and one for unitary scoring. So in 2018, you can call this like social scoring, a foresight for such systems. And then the identification obligation within those 12 principles recognizes that there's a power imbalance between the developers, the vendors, or the government agencies versus the individuals in terms of information asymmetry, information of power asymmetry, and balances, etc. So the obligation requires the identification of the properties of the AI system, as well as the organization behind it. So if you're putting out an AI system, a generative AI system, a predictive AI system, you need to identify the properties of that system, your motivation, as well as who has been involved in it. This is pretty important for us because we see this as a must to enable accountability and contestability of these systems at large, especially towards human rights and democratic values. How it evolved, so last October 2023, was the 5th anniversary of UGAI. And with the generative AI systems becoming mainstream, we asked the same questions. Does the guideline still hold with the proliferation of Gen AI systems? And we open it up to further endorsements. What emerged from those discussions, we had a day-long event, discussions, and a paper competition. 2 immediate additional considerations on top of the 12 principles. So the 12 principles definitely hold and are relevant more than ever. The 2 additional considerations was environmental impact. So we see the impact on the environment significantly amplified by generative AI systems, and we also don't have the means currently because we don't have mandated disclosures, the exact amount of impact of these systems. And this is meaningful. This is important for 2 things. One is holding the organizations accountable for their impact. But secondly, if we don't know the impact, we cannot create better systems like academic research, and better research into reducing this impact is not able to move forward either with this like the secrecy around impact. The other new issue that came up when we had the conversation on the 5th anniversary was information integrity. So obviously, misinformation, disinformation are not news. None of the stuff that we talked about generative AI are news. But what generative AI products have done is really lowering the threshold, both in terms of the cost and skills required to create whether misinformation poses the system. Let me start with deepfakes. Lowers the threshold in terms of cost and skills to create deepfakes and use that for malicious purposes, whether that is for political reasons or phishing, for scamming. Yesterday, I came across a new use case that you can create deepfakes to bypass identity verification systems and know your customer systems and facial identity recognition systems. But also there's the element of misinformation when we talk about information integrity, where if we don't understand if the limitations of large language systems particularly are not clearly understood by mainstream, we have a significant issue of misinformation through hallucinations as well. So yes, disinformation is incredibly important, but in terms of information integrity, access to information, we also need to be just as aware and proactive about misinformation as well. So long story, coming back to the UGAI, we are definitely have been advising the US government as well as international organizations on the implementation of UGAI into AI policy and regulatory frameworks, but definitely looking on how to integrate this environmental and informational integrity issues to that as well.
Thank you, Merv. And so we actually talked about the environmental impact of AI in last month's webinar, including the carbon footprint of more and more data centers and the fact that Gen AI workloads require a lot of compute power. So that did come up. It is an increasingly important issue in this landscape. Okay. Since we've zoomed out a little and now we're talking about how the landscape itself has changed, Claire and Maggie, my question to you, do you see that the current landscape of synthetic media detection tools is keeping up with the wide accessibility of the generative AI tools? Question one. And then what would you see as a precondition to help balance that out somewhat, Claire?
So this is a great question. And first, I'm going to get really nitpicky about what we mean by detection. So synthetic media detection is a discrete method of being able to gauge if content is in fact synthetic or not. So, but sometimes people say detection to refer to some of the stuff Maggie was talking about too. And maybe I'll just describe, well, firstly, synthetic media detection, which we define, and I shared this glossary that we put out a little bit ago so that people can get really wonky about the differences between different methods. But synthetic media detection methods are those that rely on looking for cues that were unintentionally added to a piece of content. So let's say nobody put a watermark in or nobody put C2PA's metadata in. What do we do? And some of you may have seen Hani Farid's work or heard of in the computer vision world, this area of media forensics. That was mostly using something called deepfake detection, which are kind of looking for cues to determine the likelihood if a piece of content was AI generated or not. And that's a reactive method, as we call it, because it doesn't rely upon the insertion of these signals. And this is a really important distinction because these detection methods are quite limited. The more we evolve them, and 5 years ago, PAI, my organization, governed Facebook's machine learning competition that was called the Deepfake Detection Challenge, which was ostensibly a machine learning competition to build these synthetic media detection classifiers that could say, is it fake or is it not, based on looking at certain aspects of it. And even the best models, the state of the art from that challenge, could only generalize, meaning only be applied to scenarios outside the ones that were actually being trained upon around 60% of the time. And that's before you even get into the reality of once those detection algorithms are shared, it introduces this kind of cat and mouse adversarial challenge, which we wrote a paper on called the Deepfake Detection Dilemma. This idea that as detection gets better, adversaries know how to evade that detection and it renders it meaningless. So detection is part of a suite of tools. It is imperfect. And what I'm really worried about, and the FTC in the United States was worried about, is a lot of these companies claiming to be able to detect with 100% certainty if content is AI generated or not. And that is overselling the capacity of detection. So that's why these kind of proactive methods and measures that Maggie's talking about, watermarking, metadata, fingerprinting, are more promising. However, I will say, to get really technically nitpicky, watermarking has a similar challenge to deepfake detection, in that if there is an invisible watermark, so let's say if you were to dive into this Zoom video in afterward and you can't see, but you were able to gauge using a watermarking key that there was an invisible watermark, so some perturbation in the pixels that you can't see, you would need this almost key to unlock that signal. And if that key is public, just like if the deepfake detector is public, then it's not useful because you could just take it out or manipulate it in a way that's really complex. So the dynamics of detection go beyond just deepfake detection. And that's why I think some of the methods Maggie's proposing are really meaningful, in that they're somewhat resilient to these dynamics that I was describing. So the takeaway being, deepfake detection, if anyone tells you that's going to solve the problem, it's imperfect. And even if it was perfect, it doesn't say true or false in terms of the piece of content. But Maggie may have musings on this in supplement too.
And in fact, when you search for deepfake detection, watermarking, and C2PA, some of the first search suggestions are how to remove, which already seems to be a problem. But yes, Maggie, your thoughts, please.
So Claire described a lot of the dynamics of this really, really well. I think, just to summarize, one of the things with detection is that it's probabilistic. It's going to give you a probability that something was generated by AI or not. That's not a guarantee. And you ultimately need human in the loop there to say, okay, we're going to make a decision based on that probability because we need to, because we're operating under time pressure, because this could have come from a threat actor, a wide variety of reasons. And I think that detection has its place in the ecosystem, especially when we think about reacting to bad actors that are not going to, in good faith, add a C2PA content credential to their work or a watermark to their work, or they're going to figure out how to remove it potentially. So there is a place for detection in this whole ecosystem, but it is a cat and mouse game and it is probabilistic. And I think we really need to be careful about kind of how we frame it, and then also the practices and procedures around actually using detection, so that people are making decisions based on knowing that they're making decisions based on a probability. And I think, with all of that, one of the things that I want to emphasize is we talk a lot about this idea of a defense in depth strategy when it comes to mitigating AI risks. Today, we're talking about a very specific subset of risks and of technologies to help mitigate those risks. And those technologies are often kind of strongest when layered together. When we think about, a detection approach paired with a provenance approach, where things are proactively labeled upstream, and we are starting to create an internet where there is kind of greater transparency as content passes between platforms, and for the content that is not transparent and there is this sort of opaque nature to where it came from, what it is, et cetera, applying detection there potentially. We can also think about applying provenance technologies and watermarking technologies in parallel as complements to kind of bolster the resilience of these upstream markings on digital content. And I think that can be a really interesting and powerful approach as well. So some people call it defense in depth. Some people also refer to it as a Swiss cheese approach, where none of these technologies are a silver bullet on their own, but we can potentially layer them to create greater resilience from a technical perspective, not only to mention, sort of socio-technical approaches, again, AI literacy, media literacy, greater education, all of that, like that none of this happens in a vacuum when we think about the technologies. And I would also just say sort of with provenance technologies, they're very powerful, especially if we think about C2PA is by design cooperative. The more people that adopt and use that standard, that choose to read and ingest C2PA content credentials and potentially even display them on their platforms, the more resilient that standard actually becomes. But ultimately, without that, it's sort of piecemeal in the ecosystem. And I think greater adoption, we've sort of seen it in progress, especially over the last couple of months, but I would really like to see that accelerate beyond what we currently see today, because it is by design a cooperative, interoperable technology. So the more people that use it and actually apply it, the stronger that whole ecosystem and kind of connective tissue becomes. And that's really important to emphasize as well. But like I said, no technology has a silver bullet. Ultimately, you know, all of these technologies have different drawbacks and benefits. So some sort of Swiss cheese approach isn't in a lot of ways best practice.
Thank you, Maggie. And Merv, I know that you have to go really soon. So just my parting question to you before you step out. So in the context of, I think we all saw the presidential debate a couple of days ago. In the context of deeply divisive politics in the US, in most places in the world, how do you see the role of content authentication, defect detection, provenance? How do you see their role in restoring trust, or are they just one piece in this broader problem?
It is definitely one piece in the broader problem, but I think trust is the heart of the issue. Everything we discuss is comes back to trust and what happens when we lose trust in the technologies, in the actors, in the institutions and process across the whole ecosystem, whether that is private organizations, vendors, agencies, enforcement agencies, or the government use of these technologies themselves. But before I answer that question, I want to quickly remark on what has been said in terms of labeling and authentication stuff. I have very significant concerns about deploying labeling practices without taking into account the cognitive elements, human cognitive elements of how users interact with these technologies as well. And the reason I'm saying that is, if you mark everything as fake, as AI generated, then you literally mark nothing. It loses its effectiveness. It loses its true reason that you put it out in the first place. And we've seen this happening with cookie banners, right? Every website that you go into, the cookie banners pop up. Save your preference, manage your preference, etc. But at the end of the day, many users just say accept all or whatever. Save default preferences because they either are fed up with it because it pops up every time. They don't see the effectiveness, or second, they've seen that all the trackers, thousands of trackers, and the cookies within these websites are not meaningfully managed, or the actors are not meaningfully held to account. So I am worried that the labeling and labeling practices may ultimately turn into the saga of cookie banners. Having set that aside, coming to the bigger picture of trust and what that means, I already mentioned the deepfakes and disinformation piece and lowering of the threshold there. But there's also the element of you don't even need to generate, if you lose trust, you don't even need to generate or manipulate a content. If you erode people's trust fundamentally, then even the authentic images, audio or video will be questioned. People are not going to believe what they read, what they see, what they hear, unless you're in the room yourself, having experienced it in the presence. You're not going to believe, or at least you're going to question. And I think that is already happening. Just from my own experience, from the experience of my colleagues and family and friends around me, we're already questioning, it's like, what's the source? Where's the link? Like, who can confirm this, etc. Immediately our reaction is becoming to that. That's what I say. We don't necessarily need generated content. Even the authentic ones will be questioned. And the third piece is around literacy. Again, I come back to the better understanding of the limitations of generative AI systems and their propensity to provide inaccurate or incomplete outputs. That both disinformation and misinformation are part of this conversation. And yes, we need more work on content authentication and detection. yes, we need more work on literacy, but we also need the vendors themselves to be more accountable and responsible in this space as well. For those of you who might not be familiar, March 2023, we actually submitted a very extensive complaint to Federal Trade Commission on OpenAI, followed by a second complaint in July, which resulted in FTC opening an investigation on OpenAI due to our complaints. And our concerns, and I'll share the details of it in the link before I leave, but our concerns were really around this basic responsible AI and governance principles that we have established over the years, and how this one company puts out a product which is very secretive, which doesn't provide any avenues for academic researchers or civil society organizations to hold the account the properties or the impact of this product. So more to come on that. But I think restoring trust also depends on the vendor actions, because I'm always looking at the bigger picture, the longer term picture, right? If we lose trust in the vendors, if we lose trust in the products, if we lose trust in the institutions, this technology is not going to be adopted the way it should, where it is beneficial, where it can create value add. And I think some of the actors might be shooting themselves in the foot in the longer term by their actions today. And with that, I apologize for having to jump. I have a commitment that I'm slightly late now, but I'll put the link on the chat before I leave.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Merv. And thank you for staying around 7 minutes longer than I said you would need to. But thank you again for your insights. Trust is a precondition, not just a result of everything that we're talking about. Thank you. Okay. So we have a few questions in the chat. There's a question from Asela, our participant from Sri Lanka. And he brings up the important point of partnerships between AI developers and media organizations. And he asks, how can these partnerships be structured to ensure the ethical use of AI in journalism? And his question is particularly focused on countries in the global South. Claire?
Sure, and it's a great question, because I think the animating theme of what we're talking about today is how do we have an accurate and trusted information environment, and who gets to decide what's accurate, and then who is facilitating trust, and what are we comfortable with? And a huge component of that, beyond thinking about how AI is affecting the generation of content, is also its distribution, and making sure that we have a thriving news infrastructure in all the contexts that information can be produced. So newsrooms, of course, have navigated the social media transition and feel very understandably that they got, swept under the rug in a lot of the agreements and deals that transpired with the Facebooks and Googles of the world. And at the Partnership on AI, we have an area of work on AI and local news, where for the past few years, we've been thinking about what does it mean for newsrooms to both adopt AI sustainably in a way that's responsible and leads to their business sustainability. And now we have this kind of inverse of what does it mean for these model developing institutions like OpenAI and Anthropic, who are hoping to be kind of the conduit to high quality information and, transcend the typical search that we do. What does it mean for them to now partner with those institutions? And that's a big question. And I'll just name a few dynamics that I've observed by working with many newsrooms brokering these deals. A lot are the ones who are the first movers. And just to share, institutions like the Associated Press, The Atlantic, I think Axel Springer, they've all made deals with OpenAI and other institutions to basically share their data for a fee so that OpenAI can do who knows what with that data. We have a lot of thoughts on what they're doing. And then companies like the New York Times, on the other hand, have not brokered a deal yet. And there are all these copyright implications and also questions of the sustainability of news, the relationship with big actors. But one of the fundamental questions is, how can remuneration move beyond just these initial deals? If the premise is we give up this data to have a seat at the table and get some money, does that mean that in 10 years that will dry up? How are these deals brokered? Does that lead to that information being surfaced in an ethical and responsible way? There was just an article in The Atlantic about how they can't really provide labels or transparency crediting in OpenAI's ChatGPT where content came from. And this question of actually what is being done, is it just to become the central body of where people encounter news? Is it just to train higher quality models? There's not a lot that's actually being shared about the value of this to these institutions. We can all posit why they want this data. But I think at a high level, the news industry has rushed a little bit into making these deals with a sense of inevitability, that only model developers of a certain scale have the capacity to train models that are as useful as ChatGPT. And I think there's this cultural sense that we need to get on board, which I think there's some merit to. We shouldn't be totally fear-mongering, but I think it's led to a bit of a rush into the newsrooms brokering deals with these large institutions. So there's not a perfect answer. I would say stronger sharing and mandating from the technology companies, not just their partnerships and legal teams, but actually their AI research teams, and explaining what this data enables for them so that newsrooms can better understand what the value is of their data set and information is really, really key. But I do just also want to name newsrooms are using AI too. If you sign on to the New York Times webpage, they're using AI to set up that homepage. They're using AI to create fake voices to read stories to you in a cheaper way. So there are really enormous opportunities for AI in newsrooms too. And the question of how that information gets shared with the world is one that I think, beyond just authenticating content itself, will remedy a lot of the misinformation and information integrity challenges we've been talking about today, if we can solve it together.
Thanks, Claire. Maggie, and I wonder if you've had any interactions. You mentioned BBC as a part of C2PA, whether some of these questions have been raised through that forum as well. Yeah.
It's a great question. And I think, a lot of what Claire is sharing, especially around sort of the business models for local newsrooms, is really an area of a lot of discussion right now with just their interactions with these larger platforms. I would say there's sort of two dynamics I see at play. So C2PA in its founding did bring together technologists and also a lot of folks in the news and media ecosystem. And the moment that we're in currently, cut to 3 years later, is we see these large generative AI platforms, particularly those that are producing hyper-realistic synthetic media, especially audio, images, video, under pressure to disclose that is AI and be transparent about what they're actually producing and putting into the ecosystem. DALL-E, Stability, Microsoft's Bing image generator, Adobe Firefly, all of these generative AI platforms do actually use C2PA content credentials and affix that at the moment of generation so that when the stuff enters the ecosystem, it at least starts with some transparency about where it came from, when it was created, what system was used to create it. On the flip side of that, I think we see institutions that have long produced kind of credible and authentic information under additional pressure to authenticate that information because of what we would call sort of the liar's dividend. Right now online, there is a lot of ambiguity in where something came from, what the nature of it is, et cetera. That did very much predate the last 2 years, but I do think the last 2 years and the proliferation of AI-generated content has really accelerated that. And what the liar's dividend is, for folks who aren't aware, it's a phenomenon that was identified by researchers back in 2019, that because of ambiguity in the origins and history of media online, it's very easy for bad actors, liars, to call into question what is real under the pretenses that anything could be fake. So an image, for example, of a war crime, say, that's not real. How do we know that the metadata is real? It's easy enough to change metadata. How do we know that those pixels are real? They could have been generated. It could have been cropped. It could have been, pixels could have been added or removed, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And that ability to call what's real into question, I also think, is a really acute challenge right now, so that these institutions that have long sort of been like the sources of credible information for society writ large are under this additional pressure to authenticate what they're doing and what they've already been doing. We see both, newsrooms like the BBC adopting C2PA for that purpose, to authenticate kind of their media libraries, their bodies of content, et cetera. And then on the other side of the equation, we see AI platforms doing the same thing, because ultimately we're trying to discern sort of what is what online and mitigate ultimately the liar's dividend. The business model question is a really interesting one that I personally am not an expert in, but those are sort of two dynamics that I've observed kind of in the ecosystem writ large.
Thank you. There is also a question here. I have asked Veronica to clarify what she means by this, but she has asked a question about companies that provide avatars to customers that can be used to interact virtually online. Do either of you have more information on this technology and its availability?
So I can jump in with a couple of thoughts here. I know Dr. Chaudhry started us off with a reference to agentic AI. And here we're talking about sort of more interactive versions of what we've seen as being enter a text prompt, outcomes an image, versus this really being have a conversation with potentially something that looks very human online. And I think there was a lot of announcements earlier this spring at some of these bigger developer conferences, et cetera, sort of signaling that this is maybe the direction that some of this is going to be going, which is really interesting. I think sort of an early pioneer in this space that I'm aware of is Synthesia. They do use C2PA content credentials to mark the outputs that come from their platform. In terms of how agentic AI is going to develop and what that's going to look like, I think that that is really going to push the boundaries of how do we disclose that and that sort of interaction, and where does that matter and where doesn't it? Beyond that, I don't have a whole lot of thoughts at the moment, but I will say Synthesia does use content credentials to disclose outputs from their platform. And it does seem like, in terms of where technical developments are headed, that might be the next layer beyond a hyper-realistic video or image. We're actually looking at just a hyper-realistic interaction between a computer and a human being.
Very interesting. I learned something new today as well. There's a comment/question in the chat, and this will be the last one before we break into the breakout sessions. Are we ready for a collective global ethical framework between big tech companies and news organizations, including those in the global majority? Do we need more harsh global AI accountability, media ethics, for example, at this stage? I know that individual countries have tried brokering that relationship between news media organizations and big tech companies. Australia, for example, relatively unsuccessfully has attempted this in the past. But the closing question to both of you.
So I don't have a perfect answer, and I think the question is, what would it do that transcends the existing press freedom declaration? So I guess what I mean by that is I think there's a lot to be drawn from existing, and we've heard echoes of this, there are existing methods in medicine and in healthcare and other fields. In journalism, this is the case too, where values of transparency, disclosure, truth are key to the, you talk about the declaration, the Windhoek Declaration, for example. And I actually think it's the AI governance field that should be learning from those existing journalistic precedents, right? Because they're actual ways to think about truth and trust that come from a field that has been thinking about that way longer than the responsible computing and AI field. In terms of what global governance would do, I think that's a question of how useful we think these declarations are right now, based on my understanding of what many of the technology companies, who I would argue for better or worse, have outsized influence on how this technology is being spread. They are not looking necessarily to global governance frameworks in the form of, UN declarations, but rather regulations in countries in the EU that are going to cause them to, be fined or change their practices. So I know that sounds a bit cynical, but I think I would draw from existing media and press declarations and then figure out how you can be like Rumaan and be in every country right now that's actually thinking about regulatory action. To your point though, Trisha, the experiments, there's a lot of uncertainty. What happened in Australia, Canada, there's a lot of debate, even in the press freedom, even in the communities that you would think would be aligned on getting more money to newsrooms about what the best solution is. So I think focusing our energy on those kind of actual regulatory efforts and testing them and debating them is probably more meaningful than going to the drawing board and starting kind of an AI and media declaration at scale. But I will share something on this topic in the chat if you're interested in learning more about it.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Maggie, your closing thoughts on this question, and then any other points that you'd like to raise before we move into the breakouts.
I agree with a lot of what Claire shared. I think there's so much effort kind of going into this space from a policy standpoint globally, not just in the US and the EU, but globally, from a technical standpoint in terms of the development of standards like the C2PA that are really set to become global internet governance standards. And beyond that, I think the discussion with civil society, the last 2 years have been kind of a roller coaster in a lot of different ways. And I would say that a lot of the opportunity right now is really around coordinating these efforts. It's not necessarily about creating something net new. Also, a lot of AI governance really builds on existing governance structures, period. And so I think we're at a moment where it's more about kind of coordination and communication between parts of the ecosystem that are ultimately really working in very aligned directions, but not necessarily aware of each other, or not necessarily like sharing and bridging full technical understanding or something along those lines. So from a really sort of practical standpoint, I think the moment that we're in now really requires a lot of cross-pollination between disparate groups that are ultimately working towards very similar goals and very similar aspirations. But in terms of an overarching governance structure, I think we're at a moment where there are a lot of horses that have already kind of started their race, and we need to just sort of make sure we're running a little bit more in unison versus trying to start a whole new race, because there's a lot of efforts already in flight.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Maggie. And thank you to Merv, who has left. But thank you to the three of you for your fascinating insights on this topic.